Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Summer Design Institute lecture series. This is our third lecture in the series, and tonight we're joined by Kofi Boone. Before I get started, I'd like to begin with a recognition that the University of Virginia is located on the land of the Monacan people. We give our honor and respect. We also acknowledge the enslaved laborers that built the grounds and architecture and contribute to the spaces we occupy today. So I'm pleased to introduce tonight's lecturer, Professor Kofi Boone. Kofi Boone is a professor of landscape architecture at North Carolina State University in the College of Design. Kofi is a Detroit native and a graduate of the University of Michigan with a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources and an MLA. His work is in the overlap between landscape architecture and environmental justice, with specializations in democratic design, digital media, and interpreting cultural landscapes. His teaching and professional work have earned numerous awards, including student and professional ASLA awards. He serves on the board of directors of the Conservation Network, as well as the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where he is vice president of education. He's a frequent speaker at national conferences and events. His published work is broadly disseminated and peer-reviewed in popular media, and he's a frequent contributor to Landscape Architecture magazine. His talk tonight is titled Notes on Resilience. Please welcome Kofi Boone.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks everybody for the invitation. And I just realized I need to update my bio, so I'll fix that next time. Well, glad to be with you all. And the topic of Notes on Resilience is a topic that has occupied my thinking. And as you all begin your journey in landscape architecture, I think that it's really one of the most important topics to grapple with. And the hopes is at the end of this, we can get into some questions and discussions about what resilience means. We know that you all have demonstrated a certain level of resilience, just even by persevering to pursue your degree and coming through the twin pandemics, and we celebrate that. But there are other issues at play as well. So with your permission, I'd like to share my screen. All right, Notes on Resilience. So once again, thank you very much for the invitation and the time with you today. We'll start with some acknowledgements of our own. I'm coming to you from the land of the Eno and the Saponi and the Shikori. And for people who are just learning about landscape architecture and geography, this is a really good sort of starting point for figuring out where you are in the context of Native communities and indigenous nations, and ask permission to share these words with you today. But we're also in the American Southeast. And I know when I was in your shoes as students, no one ever talked about slavery in relationship to landscape architecture, which there's been a sea change in that regard, because at least in the Southern United States, it is still a defining factor that has a legacy that's legible in the landscape with regard to demographics, economic development, and any manner of health indicator you can think of. This is one of the earliest census maps generated in the United States in 1860. It's a map of percent population of enslaved African people by county across the Confederacy. So I know in some cases it's hard to read, but the thing to pay attention to is sort of the saturation of color. The darker the colors, the higher the population. You can see the Mississippi River Delta in one place. You can see sort of what's now known as the Black Belt, extending from South Carolina all the way to Louisiana. And this is also a geology map, because that was the basis for determining where these large plantations and therefore the demand for enslaved labor needed to occur. So this is a really interesting map that shows an odd sort of disruptive sense of resilience, in that a lot of these counties are still among the poorest counties in our country, the most segregated and really the most challenged. So that's something that's front of mind as we start to work on projects in North Carolina. Of course, we're coming through the twin pandemics based on recent incidents with the Delta variant and other things. It's unclear whether one of those pandemics is subsiding or rising again, unfortunately. But the other one that was revealed were the huge, after the murder of George Floyd, the huge racial disparities that persist across the United States. And the landscape was the place where a lot of people made their voices heard, were really grappling with huge racial justice and social justice issues as a part of that. So the twin pandemics deal with the issue of racial justice as well as the COVID pandemic. And it brings the question of resilience and what it really means. When I first started to get engaged with this topic, and even in college, it was a topic that talked about the capacity to bounce back from disruption, right? So not returning to the same state you were before, but having some of the same function. And so it was sort of a personal sort of objective kind of term associated with ecological and environmental processes. But what we've learned is as the topic has expanded, that we can't separate human beings and societies and cultures from the workings of the planet. We are a part of this planet. And so really embracing the human ecosystem as well as the non-human sides of our world is necessary for thinking of resilience. Someone who thought about this, and we're coming up on his 200th birthday next year, is Frederick Lombstedt, who did not invent landscape architecture, but popularized it, made it mainstream in the professional practice, at least in the United States. There are a lot of things that people are recovering about Frederick Lombstedt's background. First of all, a man of leisure, right? So he wasn't trained in architecture or landscape architecture. I'm not even sure if he could draw. But he traveled through Europe, right? And he went through Europe during a time when royal grounds were opening up, particularly in England, for public use due to issues with the Industrial Revolution. He was definitely a social reformer. He believed that the quality of the built environment impacted people's behavior. And he observed that people who were really wealthy, at least in London and in England, had estates and green areas and places of retreat on the edges of London that they could go back and recharge. And that working people were in these really deplorable conditions. And he was convinced that those two were connected, that those environments were actually contributing to negative behaviors, and thought that there was a need for people to get that refuge and respite. So in England, in particular, they opened up hunting grounds, royal grounds, gardens that were formerly just for the royal family to the public for that reason, to quote unquote civilize people, that they believe being out in open spaces did that. So he believed that too. He also went through the American South before the Civil War. Letters compiled in a book called The Cotton Kingdom, which I'm sure you'll hear about a lot in the coming year as they celebrate his birthday. His observations literally on plantations of enslaved African people and their conditions. He was an abolitionist and a writer as well. So he had a really interesting sort of combination of factors. And when he gets back to the United States, he and Calvert Vaux win the design competition for what later became known as Central Park. The park initially was conceived by Andrew Jackson Downing. A generation later, the rural park in the city. It's important to note that there was no city around Central Park at the time it was conceived. They were envisioning Manhattan sort of growing eventually to surround this and the need for that kind of respite. So the book that's referenced on the left was one of my professors at Michigan, Dorceta Taylor, who I believe now has made her way to Yale, prominent scholar in environmental justice leadership and scholarship, the environment, the people in American cities, where she's trying to trace how environmental justice movements began. Why weren't they embedded in the beginning of the mainstream environmental movement? For example, she talks about the rise of cities in American history coinciding with the definition of the mainstream environment. And she uses Central Park as sort of a case study. And what she talks about is Downing proposes this incredible park. It's won as a park competition by Fox and Olmsted. But what were people of color doing at that time? What were women doing at that time? What were sort of the antecedents to the labor movement? What were they thinking about the environment? These are the groups that have been excluded historically from the mainstream environmental movement, and uncovers, through her research, that those groups were advocating for not a central park, but central parks distributed in the areas where people already lived, in the island of Manhattan and other parts of New York City. So dealing with issues of sanitation, access to clean air and water, safe places for their children to play, embedded in actual communities. And it's interesting that these were competing ideas at the time that Central Park was being conceived. And of course, we know what happened. Central Park won. It's interesting that the environmental justice angle of it is closer to how we think about insertions, urban acupuncture of open spaces in existing cities now, where very rarely are you talking about these giant open spaces. You're talking about how to sort of surgically infuse existing communities with it. The other legacy of Olmsted, which is relevant to this conversation of resilience, is that there were self-built communities in the area that we now know as Central Park. In particular, on the left, Seneca Village, which was a self-built community by African Americans and Black people. And there were a number of these. So this community was ranging between 500 and 900 people, based on how you thought about it. These were free African Americans that were completely displaced and erased in the construction of Central Park. And as much as Olmsted has contributed greatly to the value of parks, of thinking about broader systems, of thinking about linkages between the social, the human, and the environmental in fast-growing cities, there is a repetition from this to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, to many of his projects which displaced existing communities. So this connection between displacement and risk of losing one's home place due to what we ostensibly think of as a good, access to more green space for the region, remains as a tension in our profession. It's sort of embedded in our DNA, so to speak. A part of the updates to the bio, now president-elect of Landscape Architecture Foundation, and part of my responsibility the past year was to chair the task force for the Green New Deal Super Studio, inspired by House Resolution 109 by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, promoting jobs, justice, and decarbonization at a massive scale, at a federal scale, to really prevent this 1.5 degree change that everybody thinks is irreversible, at which point climate change takes over. So the Super Studio, 80 universities, 2,000 students, a lot of folks. We're actually in the process now of reviewing all of these submittals. We've got about 1,000 of them for highlighting as a part of a summit that's going to be promoted soon, to talk about ideas about how to address or challenge, in some cases, the assumptions of the Green New Deal through landscape architecture, through projects. Where we are in NC State, we were thinking about this a few years ago with response to Project Drawdown. Paul Hawkins' effort of proposing strategies for dealing with decarbonization in many different sectors. And so we were already kind of wired in terms of thinking that way. Since then, there have been other tools that have been developed. This is the Carbon Positive Design Tool, which is an online tool which allows you to input information based on your design strategies, and it provides estimates of carbon impacts and allows you to adjust them based on materials, on scale, and other elements until your project over a certain range becomes carbon neutral, has no impact on the environment. And so, we use these tools to talk about the ecological side of resilience, right? So how do we now build in the future to be not just climate neutral, but climate positive, actually holding more greenhouse gases and holding more materials than we are emitting to meet that 1.5 degree challenge in the narrow time frame. So here students are learning about microclimate and wind and a lot of the sort of available, just because of ecological processes, energy sources that we don't harness. How to calculate impacts, so how much can a tree recover, what period of time, what can we do with using rooftops of buildings to capture solar energy? How can we rethink the balance of hardscape, the softscape to reduce urban heat island effect, but also have long-term pieces? So these are all like the technical tools that are quote unquote value neutral. You'll discover that nothing is value neutral, everything has values, but these are the non-human sides. But we're reminded, this is from friend and colleague Chris Damarak down in New Orleans, is that the New Deal, the Green New Deal, which modeled the New Deal, which was developed as a part of the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression in the mid 20th century, was not value neutral. Matter of fact, it was racist. Like people like my grandfather couldn't participate in many of the New Deal programs because of race. And so there's a danger that for all the technical genius that we are generating, all the technical skills we have, that we still have the ability to exacerbate social inequality by having some groups benefit from all of that and some groups that in some cases aren't really contributing to the climate footprint at all, really suffering the aftermath. And so it's really that challenge and resilience to not just lump it all together into the non-human factors, although we do need to learn those. This model, which I think about a lot and which I use in some of the work, came out of studies of recovery after Superstorm Sandy, which hit the Northeast, a decade or so ago. And they're asking questions about why some communities bounced back, were more resilient than others. And so some of this has been heavily critiqued, and rightfully so. Issues of race and income and those kinds of things are not explicitly talked about in this model, but in the end, it came down to social cohesion, right? So, and three components to that. So, social capital, and it's interesting that since this study was done, trust and civic participation nationally has just been going down pretty consistently. Like there's a pretty serious lack of trust between sort of divergent groups, but the ability to build social capital, right, to build trust and to increase civic participation is a factor in building social cohesion. Social mobility, right? So we talked about disparities of income based on race, gender, other factors. The ability for people in the lowest tiers to have a ladder to climb, to get out, to build more income, more wealth, to have more stability, and to feel like they belong in places is an important piece. And social exclusion, right? So all of the isms, you can kind of pick whichever one you want. The more excluded people feel, the less cohesive they happen to be. So they found that the communities that bounced back faster had in these domains reasonably high scores. Simple stuff like before Superstorm Sandy, do you know your neighbors? Do y'all have each other's phone numbers? Do you rely on one another, share anything from food to childcare, what you might call mutual aid right now? Were all factors that determine this. And so it became a question of like, landscape architecture, do we have the capacity to enable this? It's hard to draw a straight causal line in human factors that because you did X in the landscape, it resulted in this human outcome. But we have the ability to disable or enable these processes from happening. So being consciously aware of how landscape architecture could contribute to social cohesion is important. One of my heroes when I was in college was Anne Winston Spirn, who right now is at MIT, but really got famous when she was at Harvard. Has a very interesting and influential book, at least for my generation, The Granite Garden, which was an important contribution to literature because it didn't separate cities and human involvement from our notion of the full environment, right? It said that cities were a part of it. These processes were a part of it. But she's probably most famous for the West Philadelphia Landscape Project, because she was at Penn for a number of years and got engaged with West Philadelphia in some of its issues in terms of landscape architecture. So with regards to the West Philadelphia project and this sort of intersection of landscape architecture and building social cohesion from sort of an environmental justice lens, she's trying to figure out, why in this particular community are there, strong concentrations of people with low wealth and all of these really poor health outcomes. And she's noticing that the structures in the buildings are in disrepair. And, sometimes that's attributed to a lot of different things, but she's looking for sort of a landscape lens to it. So she worked with students to work in early GIS studies that discovered that the whole community was built on top of a creek, Mill Creek. And that some of these buildings that are built on top of the creek literally falling into the creek. So there was an issue with land value and value of people and the value of work in this area that was contributing to the degradation of that built environment. And so as a strategy to overcome that, she starts to engage local schools and think about this as a generational issue, right? What happens if elementary school and young folks start to think about their own backyards as a part of the environment? They have a sense of agency the more they know about the things that we take for granted in landscape architecture, awareness of environment, awareness of the dynamics of change. If they have the same tools, would that energize them to become sort of stronger ambassadors and advocates for change in their communities? And so they go through all these exercises, learning mapping, DIY, design, build components, to build rain gardens and community gardens and all the stuff throughout the neighborhood. And in fact, it does have a measurable impact. If there's a group of kids, they track them, and it increased their interest in their success rate of getting into college and for becoming community advocates. Now next generations are engaged in that. Now it's facilitated by students over about a decade. Their big vision never came to pass, which was what we might call daylighting Mill Creek, right? So correcting that generational harm of putting people of low wealth and low power in the most precarious environmental condition, where they envisioned link parks, and reclaiming at that time vacant land to become a cohesive system. So sadly, this never happened, but was a part of that broader strategy. But some of the things that did happen that still exist today, this is a picture from Aspen Farms, which is a community garden that remains for food production, right? So it includes leisure and other things, but there are people who rely on it for their own survival. And this one's funny because that picture is from Landscape Architecture magazine. I think last time me and Brad may be in the same place was when it was in Philly, the national meeting. And that gentleman is working that garden. He was in the magazine. The picture on the right is when we visited that garden months later. That's the same guy. It was a complete accident. And he didn't know about landscape architecture, but we had the magazine in our pocket. So we gave him the magazine and pointed out that he was in the magazine in the garden that he was standing in at that time, and it turned into this sort of meta matrix kind of situation. But it was cool because even though he was unaware of it, he understood the benefits of it, and it could speak, authentically to the fact that it's had long-term benefits to him. In particular, he's a Jamaican immigrant, and he's able to grow some of the culinary plants that he uses, including Scotch bonnet peppers. So something that small actually gave value to that particular place. The phenomenon of Mill Creek is not restricted to Mill Creek. And so we're going to shift gears and think about landscape architecture in North Carolina for a second. Raleigh is the capital. It's a planned capital. There's a planned community. They chose the high ground between Crabtree Creek and Walnut Creek to place the capital. And the low-lying areas, they knew even then in the 1800s that those were the least desirable places for living. Raleigh was founded during slavery. And so when you look at land patterns in the Southeast, there's a term called racialized topography that was coined by Ewing and Wharf, some political geographers in 2005, when they studied about 100 Southeastern cities and tried to look for correlations between elevation or topography and race, and to see if they could predict racial composition based on elevation of the land. And for many inland southern cities, not coastal cities, there was a very strong correlation. And in Raleigh, there is, where even today, many Black and Brown communities are in low-lying areas because many of these towns were founded during the period of slavery when Black and Brown people could not own land. And it was claimed initially historically by white populations. And what was left after Civil War and Reconstruction were the undesirable parcels. And so there was an imperative to own and build and invest in place, because many Black folks in particular, their lifestyles depended on proximity, right, being close to existing cities. And so they willingly went into low-lying areas. And so there are two communities that we'll talk about. One is South Park, East Raleigh, and one is Rochester Heights, ironically named because it's actually in the floodplain of Walnut Creek. There's an aerial of it, and South Park was the first planned suburban community built outside of the central city of Raleigh, indicating that dashed white line, but specifically for Black people, it was segregated. It's the home of Shaw University, which will come up a little bit later in the talk, as well as Chavis Park, which we'll spend some time talking about. That's Chavis Park, and that shows you how close it is to downtown Raleigh. And when I first moved to Raleigh from Michigan and took a teaching position, we began engaging the South Park East Raleigh community. Was concerned about changes happening in the community and wanting a community plan, but it quickly flipped to what can we do to prevent some changes from happening in Chavis Park. So we wanted to talk about the whole community, but the community wanted to talk about the park because there was a major facility that was moving and they didn't want it to move, and nobody could figure out why. So it put us in a really interesting position of, are the tools that we're using in landscape architecture effective in enabling people to talk about what they're really concerned about? And so this is sort of a story about that. The image on the right is the community generated master plan for changes, which, spoiler, got adopted by the city of Raleigh, is in the process of being implemented. But Chavis Park was not only a planned suburban segregated community for African Americans in Raleigh, it was also one of the first mixed use places planned in Raleigh. Public housing, Chavis Heights, a school, and the park all together. It was formerly known as the Negro Park and funded by the National Park Service. And it became sort of the Black Park, analogous to, in Raleigh, the quote unquote white park, which is known as Pullen Park. So Black folks were excluded from Pullen Park, even though it's just a mile away from this particular community. So they duplicated all of those facilities, but public money, in Chavis Park. It renamed Chavis Park because John Chavis was the first Black educator in the state of North Carolina who could teach both Black and white students. And he lived in this general region. So local people advocated for that. This had been bubbling up for a period of time, oral history, narratives, anecdotes that, hey, this place has all this history you don't know about. The one that really compelled us was it was seen as one of the few safe places. You've heard about the Green Book. Green Book is a self-published series of guides, motorist guides for Negro travelers moving through the South, identified safe places for Black people to go that were dealing with issues of Jim Crow and racism in the 20th century. So between Atlanta, Georgia, and Washington, D.C., Raleigh is about halfway, and Chavis Park is in the middle of Raleigh, and that was highlighted as one of the safe places, right? So entertainers, educators, political leaders, economic people, Black folks all saw Chavis Park regionally as safe harbor and safe haven. To help to capture these stories, we realized everybody's sitting in a church basement looking at maps wasn't the way to do it, and maybe there was a situation where people could be empowered to go to the place on their own and tell their own stories. And so you all do this anyway, but you got to imagine like 10 years ago, this was not a major thing, particularly with senior African Americans just using smartphones to generate self-authored digital videos and to geotag them to a map. So we were like, come get a training. Most of these ladies that we worked with did not have a smartphone at the time. We got free smartphones from AT&T and free service for a month, and said, hey, take these for a week. You can make calls if you want to, but we prefer you to kind of go out to the park and tell us some stories and record them on the phones. So these ladies are excited because they just figured out how to do that. So this is a real picture from the training session. Led to a map. So we picked sort of a top 10 based on, we got about 57 of these, but we picked a top 10. And we like free stuff. So it's all Google Maps and YouTube, and everything's free except for the phone, right? And it was interesting because they started to talk about the community from a totally different point of view. Wasn't a lot of trace evidence of the things that they talked about out in the landscape. And this was used as a component in one of the highlights was learning that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded by Ella Baker, who at Shaw University, which is in this community, actually started in the park. So their rehearsals and practices for how to engage in nonviolent direct action when threatened by hostile white folks, they used the park to do that before they even formalized the organization later into Shaw University. And so this uncovered a lot of threads that were missed in other forms of documentation. This was compiled in a report, South Park Heritage Walk, because we wanted to create this self-guided walk that could be the armature for public reinvestment that helps tell these public stories as a part of the neighborhood. On the left is the designations of historic elements and connections to major green spaces. On the right is the route that we proposed, where targeted, reinvestment, streetscapes, new public spaces, those kinds of things, and improvements to Chavis Park as a part of that. These are some of these folks coming out of the planning process that emerged out of this for Chavis Park. So Chavis Park had not had a master plan update since the 1980s and was in disrepair. And so there was a new process developed by the city for community engagement. This is the groundbreaking for the first phase. So two things happened. One is the cell phone work was compiled with other archival work, and Chavis Park got added to the National Register of Historic Places. So it got that designation nationally based on the stories that people from that community were telling. Second one, where there was a bond issue from the city of Raleigh, of which $17.5 million were dedicated to a first phase renovation of Chavis Park, reflective of some of these cultural stories. That's the ribbon cutting that happened about a month ago. So this shows the time horizon. This is like a 10-year time horizon. For people who are into environmental justice, this gentleman in the middle is Ben Chavis, who's a descendant of John Chavis. And Ben Chavis, among other things, was part of the United Church of Christ and the Warren County, North Carolina PCB landfill protest in 1982, which gave birth to the mainstream environmental justice movement. He was there leading protests there. And through United Church of Christ produced the Toxic Waste and Race Report, which was the first environmental justice document that coined the term environmental racism and demonstrated that correlation between race and exposure to toxics. So that's a very important person in the center of that picture at that ribbon cutting. And that's just a picture of how it works all day. Brand new community center, splash pad. I got mixed feelings about splash pad, but maybe that's another lecture. But the people in the community appreciated that particular investment. We're going to move on and move further south. We talked about Walnut Creek before and elevation. In the upper left, you can see aerial downtown Raleigh. Now we're south of Chavis Park and South Park, headed to Rochester Heights. Rochester Heights, which was freedmen's land, some of the first land that was available for purchase by Black people across the South, and particularly in Raleigh. So Rochester Heights, one of the first post-war suburban communities built by Black people in Raleigh, but ironically on the edge of a bluff that descends into Walnut Creek. For people who are going to be studying landscape architecture for the first time, your eyes are going to cross looking at these maps. These are floodplain and floodway maps. So the blue area shows the main channels of 100-year storm. This is everything that I'm saying is archaic and outdated, but just for argument's sake, you don't want to build in the blue. There's a floodway, stay out of it. You really don't want to build in the floodplain. That's the purplish color. And you can see how much of that community is in blue and purple, a lot, which puts it at risk. Not hypothetical risk. So these are images from Hurricane Floyd, which was in the 1980s, which completely overwhelmed this community. There's a long-winded story about it. The short version is another community north in Raleigh on Crabtree Creek, predominantly white and wealthy, was also flooded like this. City of Raleigh decided no extra cost, we're going to fix and repair all the flooding issues there. But in Rochester Heights, we're going to get people who live in that area to contribute to a self-assessment, an additional tax. And until it builds up a certain amount of funding to afford the repairs, we're not going to do anything. What the community heard was that the Black community had to pay more to get things fixed by the public, and the white community did not. And that sent them into, political resistance, forming an organization called Partners for Environmental Justice, one of the first environmental justice organizations in Raleigh, founded by that gentleman in that picture, Dr. Norman Camp, a lifelong resident of this particular community, who got his PhD in chemistry. So he was a chemistry professor who fell in love with natural systems, environmental systems by playing in the creek. So this was not just a theoretical or an intellectual argument, there was a real issue. And what he did that I thought was really clever was not just resist, they were able to agitate and get the city to change their positions. They were then reverse their position and fix the traditional flooding issues, not for free, but without additional cost to residents, but promoted further a park, a wetland education park in the center, because they were convinced that preserving the natural functioning urban wetland was the most responsible response, and that helping people understand the value of that, and also the culture of the people that were dependent on that functioning as a system was important. So they made that case, and I don't see a lot of communities making that case. There's a lot of resistance, but there isn't a lot of taking another step of how to fix it and how to talk about it. Similar story to Chavis Park. This predates Chavis Park, but bond issue for the Wetland Education Center, Wetland Park, passed in Raleigh, and so that's the Norman and Betty Camp Wetland Education Center. Exists today. Thousands of kids and people every year come to this particular center, learn about the value of preserving and enhancing urban wetlands, build that knowledge base of the local community and its impacts. And it's really a successful venture, indicated by how people in the community on their own are engaged in these sort of sustainable activities. This is the parishioners of the Episcopal Church, St. Ambrose Episcopal Church, putting in a rain garden on their own based on knowledge that they acquired through this particular process. And so real stuff on the ground. And what's cool is we've had our students engaged in this. There were a number of faculty at NC State before I arrived who worked with Partners for Environmental Justice to conceive this idea of the Wetland Education Center and the Wetland Park. These are my students who are helping on the next phase, partnership with Parks with Purpose, on how to now extend that and start to more visibly tell the story of local people. So our students help with the decision-making process. They had a lot of priorities and a lot of sites. How do we narrow to the priorities that the community think are most important and to the specific places? And the students successfully worked with the community to navigate that process, which translated into the Bailey Drive Gateway on the south side of the wetland that I just showed you, closest to the community that was first affected, Rochester Heights. This project moved on to a design workshop led by the Raleigh office, a number of our alumni. And this was last weekend, one of the first temporary exhibitions that start to tell that story until they can build the capacity and the funds for a more permanent one. Working with an artist, Tiffany Baker, based in Brooklyn, and using glass art to show images of historical figures and historical events juxtaposed against the wetland to mark that and share that story until more permanent funds arrive. So a good story. Thanks for sharing that in the chat. And for PJ people, if you're interested, Amin Davis, that's the gentleman here, and the woman who's back to us is Anne Franklin. He's the new executive director. Unfortunately, Dr. Camp passed away, but he took the mantle as executive director of Partners for Environmental Justice. And Anne Franklin is a lifelong resident of the area and advocate, so there's a lot of continuity there. The last case I'll talk about, and then we can open it up. I don't want to take up all your time. It was resulting from current work and in aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Julian Edgemon, who's a professor of planning at Tufts University, and myself got together and we started to talk about, observing the kinds of things that people are agitating for and working on. And we recovered some history, right? Saying that, we've been talking about policies and laws and a lot of different things, but a lot of issues, particularly in cities, are revealing the fact that people don't own property or control land. And in some cases, the disparity is so extreme in terms of wealth, the ability to pool resources, a lot of things that you saw come up during the twin pandemics, mutual aid, other ways of bartering and exchanging are things that have cultural resonance, particularly in Black communities. They have real things. So we speculated on that and said that, for a moment, the aesthetics, the forms, the physical infrastructure is important. What if we really started to recover histories of cooperative ownership, of cooperative land communities, and broader as a commons, information, other things? What if we really kind of promoted the sharing idea and found historical precedent to talk about it? And this is a spin around because I think, and it's not to trigger people, the murder of George Floyd was incredibly traumatic. But what I wanted to bring up was, although he was murdered in Minnesota, he was born in North Carolina, but went to high school in Texas, in Houston, Texas. And we'll talk about why that's interesting for a second. The newest federal holiday, Juneteenth, which recently got passed, celebrates when African Americans in Galveston, Texas, discovered the Emancipation Proclamation, found that they were free. Emancipation Proclamation written in 1863. Granger doesn't come to Galveston, Union soldier, until 2 years later. So for 2 years, Black people in Texas thought they were still enslaved. Didn't hear the news. So Juneteenth is a celebration. It marks that, hey, wait a minute, we're not enslaved anymore. So that's the newest federal holiday, is Juneteenth, and that's its origin. And Galveston is right next to Houston. And in Houston, in 1872, this is Reverend John Henry Jack Yates. George Floyd went to Jack Yates High School, named after him, in the 3rd Ward of Houston. Starts to build this association, right, which we might call a cooperative, fundraising through his church and others, for a place dedicated to celebrating Juneteenth. They called it Emancipation Park in 1872. Sole purpose of celebrating Juneteenth. That's how important this thing is. That's Emancipation Park today. There's a whole lecture about the challenges with the surrounding community, but they acquired 12 acres of land in 1872. It was the first park in Houston. It predates any public park or open space in Houston. It was collectively owned by Black people for the express purpose of celebrating that holiday. And it's not an anomaly. There are places like this all over that really talk about there was this imperative for landscape to perpetuate and share, and required sharing in order to acquire and control it all over the country. It grew up to universities, historically Black colleges and universities, Black business districts, towns, all through cooperative ownership. And one town in particular that we worked with, which will close out this presentation, is Princeville, North Carolina. This is an image from the Cultural Landscape Foundation that was included as a nationally significant town in their Grounds of Democracy component, ironically named Freedom Hill. We'll talk about why that's ironic in a second. Tarboro is the county seat in this particular county, dates back to the Revolutionary War on the high ground on the banks of the Tar River, which you can see in the upper left. Princeville followed Union soldiers who came through New Bern and enslaved African people. Once those places were, plantations were destroyed and the army moved along, they started to follow the Union armies for shelter and protection, and would encamp next to them. So initially, once they took over Tarboro, Black people started to congregate on the other side of the river, other side of the Tar River, the lowland, the floodplain. And in 1865, found Freedom Hill, right? Again, we see this irony again in terms of place name, aspiration, and actual landscape. This is definitely a racialized topography issue in the floodplain of the Tar River. 1865, which makes it the first chartered town founded by free African Americans in the country. Later renamed Princeville after Turner Prince, who was a prominent carpenter in that particular community, influential to the construction of the town. What's interesting is to get the federal designation, the federal government wanted them to call it, I'm escaping the name of the president at the time. I'm blowing it. But they resisted and said, no, we want to name it after a local resident, local citizen. So it's sort of an act of resistance. But because of its position in the floodplain, it's had 14 major floods, 4 of which have completely destroyed the town in history, and they've rebuilt every time. After Hurricane Matthew hit Princeville, we worked with FEMA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and a number of others to sponsor a week-long workshop to ask people in Princeville how they wanted to move forward. Usually when they deal with the federal government, it's for relocation, right? So buyouts and building elsewhere, but for a lot of reasons, which we can talk about later, it's very difficult for a lot of people to do. And so, it was based on information that didn't have a fine enough grain. They were making sort of a one-size-fits-all situation. The outcomes of this particular workshop long-term, which have come to pass, this was in 2017, was acquisition of 53 acres adjacent to the town of Princeville for annexation, purchased by the state of North Carolina on higher ground. So rather than moving the town within the boundary of the town, starting to reshuffle it to make more resilient infrastructure closer to the river and places of safe harbor and refuge on high ground. So we were able to not shrink or relocate the town. We actually grew it by persuading the state to purchase more land, which is a pretty good outcome. But on the way, what really compelled people in Princeville about why it was important was the story, and there was no real visual evidence of that story. You weren't there, and so we, for that summer, this is summer of 2018, wanted to activate another idea. We talked about the Heritage Walk in South Park, East Raleigh. The community here wanted a heritage trail, a walking tour of Princeville that would allow people in Princeville to tell their story, have it be activated by the built environment. And so these kids in these matching pink shirts are Enviro kids. It's a summer program for exposure to environmental professions, kids in the Raleigh-Durham area, high schoolers. The young lady with the blue jacket and the black shirt is a resident of Princeville who trained to become sort of a docent or a tour guide for heritage tourism. And where they're looking is up the Tar River. And so a lot of stories with the Tar River, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. That was the starting point of this particular tour. One point along the tour that the kids were really frustrated with, and I have 2 teenagers now, so they frustrate me. You know, where's the bathroom? I'm thirsty. I want something to eat. This is boring. There's no shade. I mean, it's like real user data, but kind of, no, you're supposed to be learning history, but these kids were the exact same way, right? So it was very familiar. So we get to the museum and the Welcome Center, but as you can see from the picture, it's still damaged and rebuilding from storm damage. And so they get really mad. They're like, oh, I wish that there was a place where someone could actually go and learn this story that make it better. It was like, they start talking with them and say, well, so what would you do? And so these kids are learning about, environmental design and that kind of stuff. What if it was mobile? Like, what if you could move it? Like, what if storms come and you could roll it away, and when the storm's gone, you bring it back. So this is really interesting. I come back to the college and bump into the head of the School of Architecture, this guy named David Hill, his good friend. And he goes, yo, we've got this architecture design build studio and our project just fell through. But we got a funder and we got to do something. I go, David, just talk to these kids. They want to build a mobile museum in Princeville. It's like, really? I was like, yeah. And so we start spitballing on it, like the rationale the kids gave. We were like, hey, maybe if we want to tell this story, it could go to the Smithsonian, or it could go to a college campus. On a protest, it could go to the state capitol. It could have like agency, right? In addition to serving as a temporary element until the permanent museum is fixed. It's like, okay, I'll get back to you. Calls like 2 hours later, donors on the line, make the pitch. It's a really good idea. Talk to the town of Princeville, and 8 weeks later, there's a mobile museum. So that's real. So that's right after construction. It's currently housed right next to the museum you just saw, and is actively used. So the first exhibition in there is photos and narratives of people from the town of Princeville. There's a story about the exterior, why it's Corten steel, because Corten steel gets stronger when it's exposed to the elements and weather. So it's sort of a metaphor or an analogy to the spirit of the community. It's a conditioned space, naturally daylit, that kind of thing. So it's a great short-term outcome, because usually when you're dealing with these processes, they're very long. So this gave an instant kind of jolt, shot in the arm. And it's activating longer-term strategies. So since that occurred, and that was 2020, I think, is when that thing was completed, right before COVID. We've talked about extending that tour route that the kids started to explore, formalizing it with infrastructure. The Princeville School has now been restored, and they're building resilient infrastructure there to deal with stormwater and other pieces. And so this incremental step-by-step component has extended from it. And the thing we're all really happy about is when we worked initially with all these partners, people were talking about Princeville disappearing. But by finding ways to incorporate the story and the voice and the value of it, it activated resources. And what's happened most recently is that the entire town is not at risk for flood. They've discovered with more data that it's actually a bit more strategic, right? There are places where you can rebuild in the historic town in resilient ways and maintain that connection. And that never would have happened unless we had that level of trust and engagement initially, and if we hadn't had tangible physical results that people would benefit from in the short term. So we talk about it now as a greater Priestville, not a smaller one. So with that, closing note, if y'all are new to landscape architecture, ASLA, of course, is important, but I want to put Landscape Architecture Foundation on your radar. Among other things, we're the largest scholarship provider in the profession. So a lot of resources. These are our Olmsted scholars. Of course, the 200th birthday of Frederick Olmsted next year, but we have a program, the Olmsted Scholar Program, and really want to incentivize, encourage, and reward the next generation of leading voices in our profession. That I'll say thank you, and as time allows, can answer any questions or get into any discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kofi. Thank you so much. Appreciate it as always. My apologies on the introduction. I think I've introduced you enough times, and I'm going off of an old bio.
You're
so
good.
my apologies for missing a few things.
We'll get it together. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And so anyone, questions people might have, please feel free to raise your hand, put it into the chat, and I can call on people. And Kofi, I might just start off with one question here. We have maybe 10 minutes or so. And that is around this idea of narrative. And I think when you talk about most of these projects, you frame kind of the narrative you're projecting for that project. And oftentimes I would say that that narrative is one that kind of stakes out a ground and then kind of retells the story, or even just tells the story. I want to say retells, just tells the story. And that becomes to me an important kind of driver for all of these projects. Yeah. Even something I think in your work as simple as this notes on resilience, but even retelling that narrative through another set of lenses, but placing it within a common discussion. Then I've seen you do something similar with this work you did talking about monuments and this graphic novel piece you put together that it's just a really broad range of ways of using that kind of methodology. And I'm wondering if you might speak to that a little bit in regards to the importance of narrative in your work, and then also and how that might even be the idea of narrative might be taken for granted in the kind of dominant narrative that we don't even question, but how these narratives might start chiseling away or finding new kind of ways to puncture that narrative. If that makes sense.
It does. Thanks for that question, Brad. Your narrative is important. We're in a really difficult time now because, narratives have been weaponized. Where we are, we talk a lot about misinformation now. The idea that, people are contesting what's a fact, and what's the basis for making certain decisions and sort of giving up their critical thinking. And so, it's sort of walking this line of saying that, these, what might be called, no offensive terms, a technical term, master narratives, right? Narratives that are sort of normative, right? That everybody kind of says, yeah, that's the thing. We've started to discover that some of them don't hold water, at all. That they are actually the narrative of the most powerful, the wealthiest, and the biggest voice. And they exclude other voices. And not only do they exclude them, but they've sort of, in some ways, created an environment where challenging that master narrative has consequences, right? So just to be real for a second, the 1619 Project and Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was not at NC State, was trying to get a position at UNC Chapel Hill, her alma mater. The reason why she's not there is because the donor for that journalism school saw the 1619 Project as a threat in terms of really confronting that master narrative of what it means to be American, and prevented the vote on tenure, which led to a donor out of the sky giving her $20 million, and now she's at Howard with Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? So this is a very interesting comeuppance story of, but it illustrates that it's not without consequences. But with regards to something like monuments, right, which have been the target since the murder of George Floyd. Before, but definitely accelerated, where they're just coming down everywhere. Confederate monuments in the South, colonialism monuments abroad. This idea that the story of who's a hero, who's important, who should we all look at sort of uncritically, completely changing. So there are counter narratives, right, which are specifically designed to go right at the flaws and the problems with the master narrative. There are also meta narratives, which is kind of more where I think I'm starting to move, which are saying that all these stories have value. It's a matter of power and resources. So a place like Princeville, until we started to talk about it, like if you think of like Jamestown, Jamestown got flooded and destroyed. Of course, you're going to rebuild it. I mean, it's critical to our understanding of American history. Well, why is the first chartered Black town in the United States expendable? Netherlands is Amsterdam is under sea level, right? All these places that we really revere, the value based on them is perceptual, is narrative, and that mobilizes resources. And so the idea of unveiling alternative points of view, different readings of landscapes that really foreground stories and cultures and traditions that you're not familiar with, have the power of shaping policy, of redirecting resources, and mobilizing people to say that those places matter.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Other questions for Kofi while we have him here for a few more minutes?
I got a note from Elizabeth Alley, who's a friend. So hello, Elizabeth. And just as a note, she references Jackie Turner, UVA grad. Yes, and Jackie Turner worked on the Bailey Drive Gateway, which we showed as one of the cases. So I love Jackie.
Okay. No questions for Kofi, huh?
I have a question if no one else is going to jump in. Thank you so much. This was like an extraordinary presentation, and I so enjoyed listening to you describe these different moments and projects. And I guess I was interested in your invocation of Hen Winston Spurn at the beginning, and I guess I'm interested in literacy as a way to think about a lot of the work that you're doing. And I wonder, it seems like one of the ways in which implicitly it seems like you describe the politics of your work is about the sort of the politics of empowerment that comes with literacy. And I wonder whether you could say something further about the kind of the mode of political action that your work consists of, and the relationship between, say, knowledge and power in the work that you're doing.
Thanks for that question, Jonah. It's a good point. I think that some of it is acknowledging my position, and I think, one of the nice sort of analogies or metaphors for change is thinking about it as an ecosystem of change, and not everybody has the same role, and that's okay. So part of this is just being in a position of being in a university, where our job is supposed to be creating new knowledge and teaching best practices and making them available to folks, right? Is, where in that position, can I contribute? It's different than, say, someone who's on the front lines, doing grassroots activism. It's different from a corporation or someone in a federal agency. And but from, that position, if that's my job, is to create new knowledge and teach best practices, then part of it is helping people understand that people aren't separate from the environment. Matter of fact, in my own mind, most environmental problems are people problems. And so the idea of literacy, having a foundation of understanding how ecological processes work, valuing what we might call indigenous knowledge, right? The knowledge that people have where they are, right? Which is not the same as sort of the technical knowledge, but it's still just as valuable. So finding places for people to amplify and talk about that is where I think I'm effective. And for other forms of change, it means partnerships and working with people where that's their strength. But I would say that it's more on the advocacy side than the activist side. the equation, but I think that there is a role for activism. There's a role for all these other pieces. It's just a matter of, all of it knitting together.
Thank you. Any last questions for Kofi before we let him go? Get to dinner because it's
It is dinner time. That's right.
yeah.
I'm glad my mic isn't down there by my stomach.
Same here. Obviously, it's on my mind. Kofi, as always, thank you so much for the insightful lecture. I mean, it's great to see your work and great to hear your voice around it. So thank you so much.
You too. Thank you, and thanks to everybody. Wishing you a great summer and exciting start to your career in landscape architecture. It's fantastic.
Great. Thanks, Kofi. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, Brad. We'll see you.
Yep.